going to be a mock tour of the exhibit that I have built. I have two interpreters here that are just going to be mock guests that I'm just going to walk through my exhibit. So before I start the actual program, the theme of the exhibit was to talk about innovation in the 19th century through the kitchen. So the idea is to show through tools and technology how much innovation happened in 100 years. So that's the major theme. So I'm going to go ahead and start. So, hello, my name is Skyler. Welcome to Walnut Valley Kitchen. I am a Americorps volunteer here for the summer, and I'll be taking you through this exhibit. For some brief history of Walnut Valley Plantation Kitchen, Walnut Valley Plantation was established in 1636 by an Englishman named William Newsom. This is only 27 years after Chippokes Plantation was established in 1619. The house was originally built in 1770 by James Jones, and the kitchen and the remaining slave quarters was built in 1860. Currently in the kitchen is two separate rooms of an exhibit with the theme of technological innovation in the 19th century as seen through the kitchen. During the 1800s, technological innovation leads to the improvement and replacement of technologies and techniques that were thousands of years old, if not ancient. Further, there is no better place to see this change through than something as universal as a kitchen, and it was in the 1800s that the modern kitchen came to be. So, when you think of your own kitchen, what tools in it do you have in it that you rely on most to cook your food? So, yes, the oven and the stove are what we rely on most to cook our food today. So, when do you think those became more prominent and popular?
Real early on, after hearth cooking.
So, this is true, but hearth cooking began to be replaced by the cast iron oven and stoves in the mid to late 1800s. So the first cast iron stove not used to cook. It was very small. It's like one of those stoves that you would probably see in a house today just to heat up the home, like a small stove that has a pipe going to the roof. That was what you would think of. That's what the first stove looked like. And eventually, as cast iron became easier to make, easier to mold and deal with, became more affordable, they started making cast iron stoves and ovens, and that was around the mid to late 1800s. So we're going to start here. So how does this kitchen compare to your modern one?
Well, my oven is higher up and is not made of all one metal.
This is true. Cast iron is not popular anymore. This is because the steel process of making steel became much more affordable than making cast iron in the 1900s, and so eventually things like stainless steel came to replace pretty much anything that was made out of cast iron. So without electricity, what do you think was used as fuel in the stove to cook?
Either coal or wood.
This is true. So yes, you would have used wood first. So wood stoves were built first. Eventually, as coal became more readily available and affordable, you would have had stoves designed to use coal. And then as the 1800s became the 1900s, eventually gas and electricity would kind of replace coal at the same time. We continue to use both today. The United States is kind of unique because in Europe, especially England, they actually had gas lines before they had electrical lines. So if you lived in a city in England, you probably had a gas stove before you had electric stove. We're here in the United States, they kind of happened at the same time. So it's interesting. And the first coal-powered stove was invented in 1833. So it was first wood and then coal in 1833, and then of course, as it went on, it eventually became gas and electricity. Now this particular stove used probably coal or wood. It probably would use either. What's interesting though, kind of a side note, is the man who donated this actually retrofitted it to use gas. Yeah. But it is an 1800s cast iron stove. There's a date actually right here on the top that says, well, that might be a date, but it's in the late 1800s that when this cast iron stove was made. So why do you think, kind of already got ahead of myself a little bit here, so why do you think cast iron was the most common metal that cookware was made out of at the time? So cast iron was not something that required a lot of. Well, it's actually pretty hard to mount, but it was something that it didn't have a lot of processes involved to mold it into things. Whereas steel requires different steps before you can actually start molding it. Whereas cast iron, you pretty much heat it up, get the iron from the ore, and you can start making your pots and pans. It's just that by the 1800s, that process had become industrialized, where they can make cast iron pots and pans and skillets a lot faster. And then eventually, of course, the steel replaced it. And it was because the reason why steel got replaced is it's actually more affordable. So cast iron, of course, was affordable, but as steel became more prominent, that was even cheaper than cast iron. So that's why you see a lot of steel today. You might still use cast iron skillet today to cook, but most of the time you see stainless steel pots and pans. So we also, though, we don't just have cast iron here. I have an example of a copper cookware here. And this copper, what's interesting about copper is that actually it's one of the oldest metals that's used to make cookware, dating back to ancient times. Mesopotamia is where we find some of the original artifacts of copper cookware. But the reason why you don't see it as much today is because it's very expensive to make and find and to deal with. So, the only place you might find them is in high-end restaurants. It's very rare to find them in the kitchen, but I thought I should show an example because they've been around a long time, and chances are you might have had a couple, someone might have had it in their kitchen in the 1800s. What's interesting, though, is that all these different cookware and different metals have different heat efficiencies about how much heat they use. So they're like heat distribution. So cast iron pots and pans are one of the worst for heat distribution. They don't distribute heat evenly well at all. Same thing with stainless steel. That's where copper becomes an advantage. So copper actually is the best metal to cook in terms of distributing the heat from a stove or whatever you're using as your fuel efficiently. But the downside of using copper is that actually, if you use just if it's copper, it doesn't have a lining on the inside. Copper reacts to a lot of different acids, a lot of different things. So you can't really use it to cook certain types of foods. And before you had those liners and things that which came in the 1900s or late 1800s, 1900s, you couldn't really cook with them with certain things. So that's an interesting thing to mention as well. So a couple other things is that in the cast iron had been used for pots and pans since the 1600s, but by the 1800s and particularly by the late 1800s, you actually had more cast iron pots and pans designed for specific kinds of cooking. Like this was obviously probably used for a pie or something like that, and this against the wall here is a pan that you would have used. It has like corn cob designs on the pan, and you cook cornbread in it. So as the 1800s went on, people had more wealth and money to spend on things that specialty pans, especially pots and pans to cook with. You wouldn't really, as you'll see, you won't really find those in the early 1800s or in the first cooking period. Next thing to point out is this scale. So the scale is just an example. There's a lot of scales like it in the 1800s. This is a John Chatelain and Sons improved market scale. Actually, the company is still currently in business and has been so since 1835. But what's interesting about scales is that the first spring scale wasn't invented until the 1700s. So before that, you still had to use your weight and balance scales, which have been used for thousands of years before. So in a short amount of time, you've replaced something that had been used for thousands of years. And then the next piece of technology is actually this meat grinder. So before meat grinder, how do you think you grinded the meat?
You just chop it up.
Yeah, you grounded it by hand, you beat it, and you cut it up. It took a lot of time, took a lot of effort. So the invention of meat grinder, which was invented in the early 1800s by a German named Friedrich Dries, I believe. Yes, Carl Friedrich Christian Ludwig Freier Dries von Stauerbahn, or just Friedrich Dries for short.
That's a heck of a name.
It was interesting. He was an inventor. He also invented the first bike, except the first bike didn't have pedals. So you just kicked it along. You just
So it was like a scooter.
Kind of like a scooter, but you sat on it. He invented a lot of things. Interesting, though, since he was part of the German nobility at the time, throughout his life, he actually couldn't profit off of his inventions. So he invented things, but he couldn't profit off of them. He also was a political revolutionary for his time. He was involved in revolutionary politics. What's interesting, though, about actually, talk more about the scales in this next. So you kind of hinted at it. So what do you think you would have before stoves came in the 1800s? How do you think people cook?
Just over fire, so in the hearth.
So yes, in our. So over here we have our early 1800s kitchen. Now, what's interesting about this kitchen is that this kitchen would have been a kitchen, common way of seeing a kitchen for even hundreds of thousands of years before, potentially. Maybe not the cast iron. Cast iron had only been around for 100 years, but the hearth itself has been used for cooking since ancient times, just like the scale I mentioned earlier. So within a matter of 100 years, you lost the hearth and got the stove, which is kind of interesting. And so hearth cooking, the way you would hearth cook, is a lot more labor intensive. So you would have to burn your wood. You have to use hardwood because soft woods actually turn to ash when you burn them. They don't create nice hot coals. And once you get all the hot coals you need, you rake them out of the fire with one of your tools. And you make a pile, and then you place whatever pot, pan, or skillet, maybe, and this here is actually, I think, a Dutch oven, and just put it on the coals, and you use that to cook. Now, what's interesting, though, about these pots and pans, even though they're cast iron, there's something different about them compared to the pots and pans in the late 1800s kitchen. Do you notice?
They have longer handles.
They have longer handles. They also have, yes, they have legs. And what's interesting about that is that the pots and pans were specifically designed for hearth cooking. And that's not something, and that changes with the stove. So in the stove, you don't need long handles or legs, which probably saved money on making pots and pans. Because it was safer, you were at less risk of burning yourself. But with hearth cooking, you're at a higher risk of burning yourself and hurting yourself. The legs were so that you, of course, had the pot over the coals, not directly on them, to allow for air to continually breathe over the coals to keep them hot. So what are some other similarities between this kitchen and that one?
Well, there's a scale over here.
So yes, so over here is a my scale that is not a spring scale, it is a weight and balance scale. And these, again, as I said earlier, these types of scales have been used since ancient times. It's just an 19th century one. It's just not a spring scale. So within a matter of not even 100 years, you went from probably having something like this in the kitchen to having a spring scale in the kitchen. Now, this is just an example of innovation. It was probably unlikely to see scales exactly like these in the kitchen. Particularly in the early 1800s, if you were living on a plantation like this, enslaved people did the cooking, and traditionally measurements were not accurate or exact. It was just word by, what's the term? Mouth from
Hand mouth?
no, like from word
Oh,
word of mouth.
Oh, word of mouth.
Yeah. Just
Like
talk
farm
like it had to be.
hand to mouth.
You just taught someone, like you said, a dash of this. It was no exact measurement. So that is so that scale there might not. You probably would not have seen that in plantation kitchen. You probably seen them or in a restaurant. But it's still an example of innovation used in cooking or found in kitchens. some other things to point out. Some of the tools, besides the pots, are a little bit longer. So you obviously have this tool here. I think it's a spatula. A lot longer than the spatula in there. I don't know if you saw the one in there, simply because you don't want to be as close to it. You also have this hook. What do you think that hook was used for?
Grabbing onto like the handles of these guys and pulling them.
Pulling them out, pulling the top off, things like that. And this probably would have been used to scrape out the coals in these files. Now that's one of the things that's a similarity between this hearth cooking and still using a wood stove or a coal stove. You had to clean out the stove, just like you had to clean out a hearth. So that's another interesting thing to bring, because today you don't have to do any of that. You don't have to bring wood into your house. You don't bring coal into your house. You just turn a knob. And
Just don't bring coal into your house.
Not typically.
and you just have it. And it's more efficient than something. You're messing with the herbs here, and that's interesting. So the reason why there's herbs in here and not in there, and you might notice that there's a spice box in that room, not here.
Oh.
That's not necessarily because hearth. Because in the 1800s, you still bought spices and spices, and the same thing in the late 1800s. It's just that as just like kind of like today, most people don't grow their own herbs anymore. They buy from a store. So you're probably, again, in the late 1800s, more likely to buy your spices and grow them than you were in the early 1800s. So in Europe, you just have spices from the garden to represent that. Oh, and in the late 1800s kitchen, there's a meat grinder in here to pair with the meat grinder. You have the meat chopper and the mallet here, much more labor intensive. Much more labor intensive than using a meat grinder. By the way, I should have mentioned this earlier, but the skillets that have the long legs, don't know if we have one that is an exact skillet, but they would have been called spiders for the legs. And the Dutch oven, as it is, that's how they would have cooked bread and other things. That's how you baked, was in an oven like that. You would put coals on top as well as on bottom. So that's, of course, is replaced on the stove range by the oven below the stove. So are there any questions?
What are you most proud of making in this entire exhibit?
Probably the hearth that took the longest to build. It took a lot of effort, so that's what I'm proud of. So it could have been a little bit better, but I'm proud of it still. So in conclusion, with the innovation that I've shown you, in what ways do these innovations affect the lives of those who use them?
I mean, it made things faster,
Okay,
less labor intensive.
that's good. Less labor intensive and faster. So in other words, it's as well as safer. So in other words, these innovations make cooking more productive and saved people time. So in hearth cooking, you got to burn the wood, you got to rake off the coals, and then you got to constantly probably be shifting the coals and cook. Now what's interesting though is that the cooking part, the cooking time, is about the same time to cook anything in using hearth cooking technique, as well as on modern stoves, including even the wood-fired stoves. The only difference though is that to prepare takes more time than it does to prepare for cooking with modern stoves, and even back to wood power and coal power stoves. So that of course saves a little bit of time. And of course, that time saved could be used for other things. Probably on a farm like this, they would have saved time and probably more time to work on other things or just to relax. But main thing is, by saving time, you have more time to work doing more valuable things, and you actually, by having more time to create more value, you're actually going to make yourself wealthier and other things. So it's another reason why society itself has gotten wealthier over time, by saving more time to continue to do other things that create value. Further, all this innovation came in a historically short period of time. As I said, hearth cooking had been around for thousands of years, and then all of a sudden, with the Industrial Revolution, and new inventions, it was swept away. And in about 400 years, you have a modern kitchen, whereas it has replaced thousands of year old to ancient times cooking techniques and styles, which is historically unprecedented. So to add to this, historically speaking, we live in the fastest stage of innovation, and it can be seen just by looking at the past 200 years of kitchen history alone. Thank you for your time, and hope that you have enjoyed your tour. If you're interested in seeing a real hearth, and not just seeing a representation of one, head down to the mansion at Chippokes. There at the Brick Kitchen, they have a usable hearth, and sometimes they do hearth cooking demonstrations. Thank you again, and I hope you enjoy your day.
All right.
Nice.